Hello, and thank you all for your patience. And this is, if any of you out there are brilliant digital folks, talk to Laura, talk to me. Let's get this thing worked out sometime. But as I was saying, in talking about Black cooks, typically stereotype was demanded rather than reality. And you can see with the kind of kitsch that was available in the 20s and the 30s, the very kind of noxious material that was used to discuss or to show the cook of the day. Here's another, as you know, very, very late. And so it's a very noxious vision of what was happening. And there was the notion that Black cooks cooked all by instinct. And they measured everything with a smidgen of this and a smidgen of that. And they didn't really know the exact ingredients. And they didn't have ways of having it other than just in their head. And there's people like Duncan Hines who said, I spent hours in Southern kitchens trying to figure out how the cooks and to learn from them and just how much went into a particular dish. And I could just never figure it out. Now, of course, we could certainly understand that the cooks didn't want him to know because it was none of his damn business. So we have this image that is so ugly. And we have more of that image of the cook as inept and now, of course, when we're talking about real cooking of the 18th century and of the antebellum, what we're really talking about are exquisite, quite fabulous menus. If you look at this menu that's here and you see the way it's laid out and you get a sense of what has to be done, I would argue that the kind of instinct that was often referred to about the cook came from experience. It takes 10 or 20 years of learning how to cook, to do this and make this magic. And sending 30 dishes to the table, as was common in the antebellum period, takes planning and choreography and decision making and split-second timing and care and thought and physical strength and endurance. And only with those attributes in culinary performance be described as instinctual. Here you see the world of Monticello. And in this story that I'm going to be telling today, the food is important, but the stars of the story will be Edith Hearn Fawcett and Frances Gillette Hearn, sisters-in-law, cooks, chefs indeed, mothers, and slaves in the community of the enslaved owned by Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. You see a rendering of what Mulberry Row might have looked like at its busiest. And in this story, the kitchen is the stage, the food is the dressing, and Edith and Frances, Peter and James and Ursula are the actors. The script has an air of improvisation because Jefferson only wrote down what interested him at any given time, and his daughter and granddaughters were not dedicated housekeepers in the manner of their aunt, the cookbook writer, Mary Randolph. Thus, we have some idea of individual favorite dishes, usually desserts, but little idea of whole menus. So we're going to start with the cast. Those in green, as you see here, the two Ursulas, James Hemings, Peter Hemings, Edith Hearn Fawcett, Frances Gillette Hearn, and Hannah at Poplar Forest. So we have part of the group. 9-year period, 3 different young women from Monticello were trained at the president's house to meet the demands of Thomas Jefferson's dining style. They were each related by blood and or eventually married to 4 major family groups at Monticello: the Hearns, the Gillettes, the Hemingses, the Hugheses, and the Fawcetts. The women followed in the footsteps of previous extended family members who cooked for Jefferson. Originally serving as Jefferson's body servant, in 1784, James Hemings accompanied Jefferson to Paris for the express purpose of learning French cookery. The 19-year-old began his apprenticeship with Monsieur Combeau, a caterer, and also with a pastry chef and chef in the household of the Prince of Condé. By 1787, James Hemings began his work as chef de cuisine in Jefferson's house on the Champs-Élysées for a wage of 24 livres, or about $4 a month. And back in the United States in 1790, James Hemings cooked for Jefferson in New York City and Philadelphia, shopping at the markets and acting also as a butler. He then made an agreement with Jefferson. They struck a bargain. In exchange for formal manumission, Hemings would return to Monticello, and there, quote, "he shall have taught such person as I shall place under him for the purpose to be a good cook," unquote. And that person turned out to be Peter Hemings, as James's younger brother. And Peter continued work cooking at Monticello till 1809. Upon his inauguration and move into the president's house in 1801, Jefferson had Ursula, daughter of Bagwell and Minerva, and granddaughter of Great George and Ursula, sent to Washington to learn the art of pastry making. Her grandmother, Ursula, had been the cook so many years before, when Monticello kitchen was below the South Pavilion, and the mistress of the house was Martha Wales Jefferson. The 15-year-old Ursula stayed in Washington for at least 6 months, and when she returned home, her experience in that demanding kitchen seems to have stood her in good stead, because she then continued to cook alongside Peter Hemings in the Monticello kitchen all through Jefferson's presidency. In the fall of 1801, Edith Hearn Fawcett, at age 15, was sent to Washington to begin training as a cook under Jefferson's chef, Honoré Julien. She was joined there in 1806 by her 18-year-old sister-in-law, Frances Gillette Hearn. Now, why might those particular girls be chosen? At Monticello during the 1790s, as their cousin James Hemings taught his own brother what he had learned in Paris, Edith and Frances may very well have begun their lives of work in the Monticello kitchen under the direction of cousin Peter. Most enslaved children began working about between ages 8 and 10, and as scullions, Edith and Frances would have stirred pots, grated sugar or salt, washed vegetables, carried covered prepared dishes to the office, among a host of daily mundane chores. The requirements of a smoothly run kitchen would not be new to either of them when they arrived at Washington. Now, we know that James Hemings could read and write a fine hand, and his younger brother, John, carpenter and skilled joiner, could also read and write. But we don't really have any documentary evidence of whether the other cooks could at Monticello. People usually kept that kind of undercover because more and more the laws were made it illegal to teach enslaved to read and write. Excuse me, we're going back here because this table setting for winter and summer gives you a sense of the training that had to be taken place to see the results of these kinds of meals. Never before had such dinners been given in the president's house, said one Washington resident. The dinner was excellent, wrote Benjamin Latrobe, quote, cooked rather in the French style. The dessert was profuse and extremely elegant. And you can see here that this is just a small dessert table for winter, one for winter and one for summer, the range of desserts that might be served. We then have a list of his butler's list of the pairing of wines, different kinds of food. So they were really thinking a lot about this, and the young women in the kitchen, along with the chef in the kitchen, had to know this. Now, the meal served on April 3rd, 1807 was about as simple as it got at the president's house. Several politicians attended, But it was not a day with either an open house or a dinner party. It wasn't particularly special. The four guests were just colleagues discussing impressment on the high seas over dinner. Now, under Honoré Julien's direction, Edith prepared his specialty partridge with sausages and cabbage, while Francis began the dessert custard. And as in that table setting slide I just showed, each dish had its particular placement on the table. Excuse me, the ham of bacon, what we would call a baked ham in the center, and arranged around it was a spit roasted quarter of bear. It had been aging for 6 days, and we know from the list of the foods that Lemaire bought that he had bought a quarter of a bear 6 days earlier. Beef bouilli, a very slow simmered rump of beef with vegetables, the partridge with sausage and cabbage, a soup, potatoes, rice, spinach, beans, a lettuce salad, and pickles. And after the course was finished, the servants removed the dishes and the head chef placed the main dessert, described by one present as a kind of custard with a floating cream on it. And we know that, of course, is floating island. And it was surrounded by complimentary sweets, apples enclosed in a thin toast, and on each side, 4 dishes and 3 in the middle of cakes and jellies. And it was only after the dessert was finished and the tablecloth removed that the wine was served. Portuguese Madeira, Spanish Pajarete, French Hermitage, and Italian Nebbiolo. In more than 12 dishes around the table were set olives, apples, oranges, and nuts. This is the kind of meal that these cooks cooked every day, no matter how few the people were to eat. So without doubt, when Edith and Francis returned to Monticello, they were fully prepared. Years later, in 1824, Daniel Webster recalled, quote, "Dinner is served in half-Virginian, half-French style, in good taste and abundance," unquote. Well, now we're going to examine a little bit of the stage on which this culinary action took place. And as early as 1670, elite houses in England and France were using the stew stove. And in some cases, such masonry units were being used in conjunction with an iron range even. And by Jefferson's day, the stew stove was a standard configuration drawn into plans of books of architecture as part of the just what every cook should have. And we know that there was a 4-hole stew stove installed in the first kitchen in the South Pavilion that was built in 1771. In a stew stove, the cooking areas were built on a waist-high surface of the masonry unit, and then there were adjustable grates that helped hold the charcoal fire, and it was perfect for copper pots, other more delicate, thin brass pots that could be used to make creamed or otherwise very delicate kinds of dishes that the cook could adjust for temperature, and the ashes kind of fell down below, and the smoke was diverted via a system of flues to the fireplace chimney. This kitchen is what was happening, what was being shown in the 1950s at Monticello, which was the colonial revival kitchen. And of course, that then had to be restored to make sense out of it, because the original stew stove was not in place, and the rustic fireplace with its rifle and all of that kind of really ridiculous kinds of furniture in the kitchen would not have been a place where really, delicate, sophisticated dishes could be made, like these quenelles, which are made of salmon that's finely chopped and has veal or fish and lemon and mace and pepper and eggs and all kinds of dishes that a kitchen, a rustic kitchen such as that, a colonial kitchen, or one of the more rural kinds of kitchens that we see in cabins could possibly have presented. You know, the food from a kitchen like this that you're seeing now at the Rural Life Museum of Baton Rouge was tasty, certainly, but uncomplicated, very, very plain. And so most people did essentially what I call cast iron cooking. They were just cooking over a hearth and had stews and soups and other pretty quite simple and plain forward dishes. Here I am cooking on Mulberry Row many years ago with, again, plain cast iron pot cookery. But in the James Hemings inventory, we see from the dishes that were available, the pots and pans that were available, with just an incredible array of foods that meant that Edith and Francis could cook all manner of foodstuffs. And we can, of course, really enjoy James's beautiful penmanship and his French. And they would have cooked, and Edith and Francis could reasonably expect to stew and fry and braise and boil and bake. And with all of these pans, they could make sauces and coffee and tea and jellies and preserves. They could whip egg whites and churn ice cream. And as part of the mundane scheduling of kitchen chores, they kept a continuing yeast starter live and bubbling for all the raised breads that were served. Margaret Baird Smith visited Monticello during Jefferson's presidency and left her impression of the food she ate there. Our breakfast table was as large as our dinner table. We had tea, coffee, excellent muffins, hot wheat and cornbread, cold ham and butter. Now, at that time, many people kind of thought that hot bread was bad for the health. They had a lot of different kind of strange ideas about nutrition and digestion, really. So that Jefferson's serving of hot, freshly baked breads was really kind of an unusual thing. Now, part of presenting these beautiful meals were the flavors that came from many kinds of made sauces that that accented meat and vegetables. And so here we have a combination, which I think is telling. We have the bread list for 1810, which tells what everybody got, the rations for the enslaved people, including the cooks, may I add. But the cooks were then preparing a dish in which there was bacon and veal and champagne and coriander and scallions and cloves and bay leaf and olive oil, all of those kinds of things that the cook had to have in their kit bag to know how to make for adding to various dishes that would be important. Now, given that ration list that you're looking at, we can go to the idea of the fact that everybody had to have gardens, all of the enslaved, and Monticello has done work to try to find them. Gardens are kind of light on the ground, so they're hard to tell, but we have the list of what the people who lived there sold into the Jefferson economy, the vegetables and eggs, over whenever the president was home for his vacation during his office. And here's just one September Sunday, 3 Simlins, which are patty pan squashes, you know, the little scallop squashes like that. Okay, 6 cabbages, 16 dozen eggs, 11 chickens, 1.5 dozen cucumbers, 1 watermelon, 1 muskmelon, and 1 fish. They don't say what kind of fish, but just in one day, we understand that people with their gardens and their own proficiency were growing things that they could then sell into the Jefferson economy when he was home. He hadn't built that big garden yet. Everything was still in construction. So during her long career in servitude, Edith Fawcett gave birth to 10 children, 2 born while she lived at the president's house. All these births and the child rearing had to fit into her demanding work life. And Frances Hearn also had a large family and had to juggle responsibilities of motherhood with her work. We see here the style, the empire style that was beginning to be fashionable in certainly in elite women's clothing, but that silhouette you would see all the way down through the servant class as well. Just that the puff sleeve and a gathered bodice and the long, fairly narrow skirt. And the scullion was almost the same. She was a little simpler, her dressing, but we see two pictures of women that are posed and are in many ways quite respectful renderings of cooks, because they don't have a lot of that, as we saw from the very first slides, that making fun kind of imagery. And both of these women's husbands worked very hard, and both of them lived probably somewhere along the South Pavilion while they did their work. Now, this is a list of what is listed in a particular book that Martha Jefferson Randolph had. That was a cookbook, and it was listed with all of these French terms. And certainly Edith would have been familiar with these. After having served for 8 years under a French chef, none of these terms would have been unknown to her. And so we know, we have a sense that she knows, that the cooks knew certainly what the mistresses knew at the very least. They were training in a household where adult white women had to learn to be housekeepers. And what they did was they kept track of all the food. They kept track of where it was and how it was stored and how much needed to be ordered and how much was being used at any given time. And we see here that Martha Wales Jefferson kept a very accurate account. They killed 15 hogs. Now, we certainly know she didn't kill the 15 hogs, but she wrote it down. And from that, we can get a very good idea of what the work was for the staff, the yard staff and the cooks, during at least those 2 weeks or so while all of those hogs were killed. You don't really kill 15 hogs in a day. It's going to take a bit to do it. So the duty of the house mistress and the children and the young women who were learning under them was to keep the locks and keep the keys and planning on everything that had to be done. And no matter all of the what we don't know in many ways about the daily interaction of she of the keys and she of the hearth on many levels, we do know that the food was wonderful and it kept coming every single day in these great volumes of food. And we just have here just some array of foodstuffs that would have been cooked and used and prepared that the cooks would have known in their day. They ate a lot of cabbage. They liked cabbage. Now, Thomas Jefferson died in the summer of 1826, and at the estate sale in 1827, along with 130 other people who went on the auction block, Frances Hearn, her husband David, and their children were sold to a professor and his wife at the University of Virginia. Joseph Fawcett was freed in Jefferson's will, but his wife Edith and 8 of their children were all sold that day. With the help of extended family in Charlottesville and Albemarle County, Fawcett was finally able to buy and free Edith and several of their children. And by the late 1840s, the Fawcett family had moved to Ohio. Left behind and still enslaved, young Peter Fawcett was sold. He ran away and he was sold again. And he was finally freed, leaving for Ohio to join his family. And there he became a noted caterer. In 1926, Wendell Dabney reported that in Cincinnati, Peter Fawcett connected himself with the catering establishment of Miss Kate Jonas, who in her day was par excellence in this art. On her retirement from business, Mr. Fawcett purchased her wonderful collection of china, linen, and silver, much of which could not be duplicated in America. His clientele, he continued in this business until within a few years of his death, his clientele being among Cincinnati's most wealthy and aristocratic families, he being one of the city's leading caterers. So the tradition of Edith's fine cooking was followed again by her son, who was finally rejoined with his mother, and surely she must have taught him quite a bit. So, you know, we're all aware that Jefferson has this mantle of America's gourmet president, but he didn't introduce vanilla ice cream and French fries, and he didn't eat a tomato on the courthouse steps to prove it wasn't poison. But he did love fine wine, and he became really promoted the idea of viticulture in America and in his home county. And his style of intimate and congenial dining is also deserved. But the excellence of the food in the dishes on the table rests squarely on the hands of his chefs. And the tradition of this food and beautiful presentation carried on in the mountaintop kitchen was sustained through the rest of the 19th century and beyond by the descendants of the Black cooks at Monticello. And I thank you. I'd be glad to take questions.
Thank you, Lenny. That was great. Can we, you could stop your screen sharing, or I can do that. There we go.
Thank you.
All right. So if you have questions, please go ahead and type them in the chat, and I can read them out for Lenny to tackle.
I realize I did not pay attention to the time. I'm sorry if I've overstepped my bounds.
No. Even considering our technical difficulties, we're still
okay, good. Okay.
Let's see. I have not seen any so far.
If they don't ask any questions, they have to write the 250-word essay.
They have to do a report.
Right, they got to write the report.
Let's see. Candy asks, what would the pots and pans have been made out of? Would it have been cast iron?
There would have been a lot of cast iron, certainly kettles, things that hung over on trammels, you know, the large arms that hinge that came out of the hearth, right over the direct heat of the fire, in many sizes, from very large kettles. They all had bales, the wire handle, and you could use them to boil water, or you could use them to cook small things. There were other cast iron that sat on the hearth floor itself, where if they had legs, you shoveled coals underneath, and if it had a certain kind of fitted lid that sat down in it, you could put the coals on top as well, so that you could bake in what came to be called a Dutch oven, and it really was. But a Dutch oven, of course, could be used to just make a stew. But so you had that. You had brass pans, but this is where the stew stove in that level of cooking was so vital, is that because you had the pans were separated from the charcoal heat on trivets, and you could adjust the kinds of trivets you use to have it lower or higher above the charcoal. And those were, in that you could cook really delicate things, that it was very hard bending over the hot hearth, which was full of flame. You know, you had hardwood full of flame because you used a lot of coals. You were always using coals that you were pulling out with a shovel out from the main body of the fire to be using with your pans there on the hearth itself, not in the hearth, on the hearth that was right in front. And then you had, especially if you had stew stoves, you would have had a corner where you would have had charcoal, and it would have been burning so that you could shovel that charcoal into the stew stove to be used. So everything's hot, but the copper pots that you see would have been used in this very a manner such that you could more precisely gauge the heat. So that's kind of the range of cookery pots.
Mercy asked, did the cooks there use scales for measuring?
There is a set of scales in the Jefferson kitchen at Monticello. Certainly Mary Randolph in her recipe book, which I recommend to anybody that's interested in food of that era, always has a lot of things measured by ounces. And so one gets the idea that scales are very common in the elite kitchens. I don't know about, the kitchens of certainly the very poor. It would have been a moot point. Middling women, middling farm women, especially for things that had to be precise with flour or butter, especially dessert type things, or maybe when you were salting things and you need to have a ratio of salt to meat or salt to water or whatever, you would weigh it out. And it isn't until near the end of the 19th century that Fanny Farmer devises the measuring cup as we know it, where you're dealing with cups and quarter cups and teaspoons and tablespoons and the notion of level and that kind of cookery. Before then, many people would have had some kind of scale in their house. I use scales a lot. I have come to use, and I've had to learn to use them. That was not the way I learned to cook. I learned to cook kind of in the Fanny Farmer way with just glass Pyrex measuring cups and, measuring spoons. And I have learned that Mary Randolph has taught me, because I've been cooking from her book for a long time now, how useful scales can be.
Yeah, they definitely are much more accurate in baking. I can say that from experience as well. Kathy asked, who was it that was teaching the enslaved people the cooking techniques?
Well, it's kind of one of those, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Obviously, many people, as they become scullions, they're there as apprentices. That's their job. Harriet Horry tells us in 1770 that Marianne does the roasting, and she cooks and she makes the punch, and Diana makes good bread, but she needs to really practice everything that she's learned at the other plantation where they have been, so that to improve her cookery. We have old Ebba, who is skilled at fattening poultry, and I imagine in the butchering and plucking and gutting and producing good, beautiful, clean birds ready to be cooked. And we don't know if young Ebba is her daughter or her granddaughter, but young Ebba is tasked at washing, learning to cook, bringing in wood, taking out ashes, what the other thing, and learning to cook as much as possible. And there was one other thing that she was, and to learn washing. So the learning by being at the side of someone doing it is pretty much what everybody, white and black, rich and poor actually, learned to do the thing that they were going to probably do the rest of their lives. They apprenticed with someone and then they learned to do it. So cooks are teaching always the people in their kitchen who are going to, at some point, at least one of them is going to replace them and step into that role. The house mistress may be, such as we see in Mary Randolph, a house mistress who knew a good deal about food, who had had a long experience with food, and may indeed have worked in a very constant teaching, learning, teaching method with her cooks. We really don't know anything about her relationship with her cooks, whether it was hostile or neutral or benign or any of those things. She doesn't talk about it, and we don't know their names. But there are obviously other housewives who it's just about all they can do in between children, to make sure that there's enough of the food that they have to be able to cook. They really depend on the cook's knowledge, because either the housewife is very young and hasn't had much experience herself. So the cook is really a person who is very important in this elite house complex, because how much she knows is going to reflect on this dining table, when they serve these meals every day. So they're always learning. They're learning by doing, and they're learning at the side of someone who has done it longer than they have.
Pam asks, how were the hogs preserved after slaughter?
Primarily, they would have been salted, immediately cut and salted. And so there have been great wooden trenches that looked like dugout canoes, actually, with salt. And the salt had to be prepared. Had to make sure that it was the right salt, that it had been sifted so that it could be used. And the meat had to be chilled, and it had to be hung. And the reason they're doing it in January, of course, that's about the coldest time, of the year in most places. So you have that's the majority of the muscle meat of the pork, is the hams. Then you have all of the offals. Well, most of those, unless you're going to pickle the feet and pickle some things that you're going to make, much of the other stuff needs to be eaten right now, because it doesn't hold, it doesn't salt, it doesn't store. And so everybody, white and black, would have this surfeit of all of these offals, and they used it, and they made souse and scrapple and other forms of doing it. And we know that not merely the enslaved or just poor white people ate these things. Martha Blodgett, who was a wealthy woman, lived on a Tidewater plantation, remarks quite, just casually one day that her mother-in-law has brought her a delicious dish of souse, and it happens to be in like February. Okay. So everybody's eating souse because nobody's going to waste anything. That's for sure. And those are very common. Now, by the middling 1820s and 30s and 40s, food fashions also change. The elites are eating kind of different combinations of foods, and they're no longer kind of eating these older, more what they might consider countrified dishes. But certainly people who are countrified and who do live on small farms and the enslaved are still eating those dishes all the way through the 19th century and well into the 20th century. And so they become, they're then considered country dishes, or only dishes that poor people eat, or they're diminished in a way. And we forget, because we haven't really had a chance to look until fairly recently at the foods of the elite. It just fell out of fashion in many kinds of ways. So that everything got eaten on that pig except the squid.
I'm going to skip ahead a couple questions. I'll go back to the previous ones, but this is a little bit in the same vein about the seasonality of recipes. Were they all seasonal recipes, or did the cooks rely on canned or preserved foods for their cooking? That's a question from Susan.
Well, certainly until after the Civil War, we don't have canning, but they certainly have ways of preserving food. That sauce Espanol that I told you about, that was made and then put in bottles and would last till it ran out, and then they'd make more. But they had ways of making sauces and jellies and jams and preserves and marmalades. And Harriet Horry tells us how to, and this is 1770, to preserve tomatoes for winter use. And Given her South Carolina climate, she says doesn't do you any good to do it before October because they just don't last. So we get a sense of her seasonality. But she's got these tomatoes. She's cut them in thick slices. She's put salt between them and onions, and she's layered them in a crock. I mean, there's a whole process so that for at least, who knows, 6, 8, 10 weeks, maybe 3, there's tomatoes available. And she says each pot, as she describes it being stored, will make 2 soups. So she's making tomatoes for soup, tomato soup. At Monticello, you've got, again, the jellies, the jams, the marmalades, all of those things. And many of them, of course, have to be done early. You have to do raspberries when raspberries are ready. And then you do whatever. So whatever fruit has to be made, and it has to be cooked down. And again, this is where those copper pots on that stew stove are really helpful, because you can cook on them very, very fine tuned. They don't have thermometers, but they're probably using, a spoon with the drop method to see if they've reached the jelly stage. The cooks know this. They just have had the experience of doing it. And remember, Edith and Frances have had 8 years at the president's house with a real French chef, along with, I argue, as girls being in the kitchen with James Hemings when he's teaching Peter. So they have a strong sense of how far ahead you need to be thinking. And so you have these meals, they're happening every day, and they have these differing ingredients, many of which have to have been made months ahead of time, or made when somebody decides to buy a barrel of lemons and they get it. Well, when they get it, they then make lemon pickle, which is again a flavoring in a savory way. When they have mushrooms, they make mushroom ketchup. When they have walnuts, they make walnut ketchup. And these are all cooked down and reduced, and they've got lots of sugar or salt in them. And then they're kept in bottles that have been sealed, and generally in cool, dark places. I hope that answers a bit. There's a lot. We could spend hours with it.
Absolutely. Mercy has a couple other questions. Was the baking done in the kitchen or elsewhere? And what was the major source of heat in the hearth? You did talk about using a lot of hardwood. She asked if any coal. I know you mentioned charcoal, but
yeah, no, coal is so stinky. It just was not a culinary use. Now in many places, when you see these old big old hearths, you see the oven can be placed in different ways. Sometimes the hearth is so big that the oven is actually tucked inside, partly so that when they scrape the coals out, it goes into the hearth. At Monticello, the oven is to the side. It has its own flue up into the chimney, so you can have a nice big fire in there and get it nice and hot. But you still got to scrape those ashes out, swab the floor down, and no, you're not throwing a pizza in there, but you're putting, it's a descending heat. So you're going to start in the early morning after having really gotten it hot. You're going to start with those hot breads that Margaret Baird Smith mentioned, those muffins. You can, and then breads, and then you might start with cookies, and then breads, and then something that would take longer to cook, that you would want to bake in the oven. But they had an inside oven there at Monticello. Now sometimes you go places and people had it situated, maybe it was just outside the kitchen door, but it isn't like the ways in which in the American Southwest you see the ordinal that's outside and that's separate. It isn't quite like that.
Another equipment question. Sherry asked, would Jefferson chefs have had a clock jack for powering the spit? They actually had a winding,
it wasn't a clock, it was, I guess you'd call it a clock jack. It's a winding clock, it had gears, and you wound it, and it ran for about 10 minutes. Now that means some little kid whoever is the lowest scullion on the pecking order probably is put in charge of that thing to make sure that it once it looks like it's going to stop, he winds that sucker back up. Now in the Jefferson kitchen, there was also a real clock. So we actually know that those people that worked in that kitchen had to know how to tell time, which was not necessarily something that everybody in that 18th century and the 19th century, early 19th century knew how to do. So they knew how to actually read the clock, and it's a so that was a skill, and because you had things that had to cook for 5 minutes and 10 minutes, or watch those. They called what we call cookies. They called biscuits in that English style. Tavern biscuit is a wonderful little recipe of a wonderful little cookie. It's a firm, crunchy cookie, and it has to cook for about 8 minutes. And somebody's got to watch it, or that's going to burn. And then, you will have wasted dough, and nobody wanted to waste, because remember, cooks could be sold, cooks could be beaten. It wasn't just all hanging out in the kitchen doing really great stuff. It was under this umbrella of enslavement, where punishment was quick and swift and harsh, and nobody, everybody needed to be on top of it all the time, because every day, 365, at somewhere between 2 and 4, dinner had to get served. And it was what for many of us would be just an incredibly fancy meal. 2 and 3 meats, 2 or 3 kinds of vegetables, and several desserts every day. So, and then you had breakfast. Remember that breakfast that we talked about? So they had to get up in the morning, and they ran the whole time. And then they had to prepare in the afternoon, because there was probably at tea, which would really be what people kind of call supper, a little for people who needed a little more nosh, or needed a little extra. And then they would prepare that. The cooks were busting all the time. There wasn't time to do anything else but cook and supervise and make sure that it all happened on time, because it wasn't they that were eating it. They didn't have any they didn't have any influence over the timing of those meals. It was the mistress and the master of the household who said, this is the breakfast, this is dinner, and this is tea or supper, and that's when we expect to have it. So, no wonder the cook had to live literally next door to the kitchen.
And there is another question. Pam asks if the kitchen was separate from the main house, or part of the main house itself.
It at Monticello, the way it is configured, and you can go online and take literally a visual tour all the way through. It's very interesting to see how it is situated. It is below the level of the house, but it is to the side of the house. So, in some other houses, the kitchen might be in the basement. In other houses, it might be Mary Randolph's house in Richmond. It was a few steps outside her yard. In her yard was the kitchen right next to the slave quarters. And so it would have been a few steps to come in to the basement, at which point there may have been a small fire to finish things, perhaps, or keep them warm before they were sent to the dining room upstairs. So there was a lot of different configurations. There, of course, were places where, they'd put the kitchen way out because whatever was a nuisance, and then trying to keep the food hot. They had trays, they had ceramic platters that held hot sand, that were full of sand that you could heat it on the hearth, so that you could put things on that, and that would keep them hot. You had ones you could put hot water in. You had, lids on things. You had a lot of different ways. And while, the whole idea of having it removed so that it doesn't burn down the house has a certain legitimacy, particularly if the kitchen's made out of logs and the house is made out of wood, then but some of it, I got to tell you, is just mean-spirited bullshit. Do you know what I mean? Just people they had all these enslaved people who could work however they wanted them to work, and they did, and they didn't have to care. They didn't have to care how hard it was. They didn't have to care how hot it was. They didn't have to care how, much time it took or any of that stuff. They didn't have to care. And the law didn't make them have to care, and nobody made them have to care. So they didn't care. I mean, that's kind of my take on all of it. So it could be as inconvenient as it could be, and other times it could be pretty convenient, just because of the arbitrary nature of whoever was in charge.
This a related question from Pamela. In the elite households, who did the cooking for the enslaved people?
Well, so we see that those rations, and we know that Edith and Francis got the same damn rations that everybody else did, right? Peck of corn, whatever. They had all these children. But because there was, and it would appear throughout as many venues of slavery as I've been able to determine, there was just almost always a strong sense of community. There were many people who were related by actual blood kinship or fictive kinship, and they all understood that they all had to work and they all had to do what they had to do. And I think they stepped in so that Edith's little children could be fed during the day. They weren't under her feet in that kitchen, so obviously someone was taking care of them. Children started working early, and they often slept and even certainly slept where they worked. The nail boys slept upstairs of where they worked. This isn't to say they didn't have relatives in other places that they visited and may have eaten some there. Who knows? It's hard. This is the place where the sense of community, the sense of connectedness, the sense of obligation and reciprocity within the Black community is clear and evident, because otherwise nobody would have survived. Nobody would have survived. So obviously it's there. That's as far as I can see. And how it exactly worked, we don't always know, but we clearly see, if we read the slave narratives, the ex-slave narratives, when we read the book, that while there were people who were, had been brutalized beyond the ability to be kind, or more people were able to be kind and offering of their help to other people who were all in the same situation. And of course, in Jefferson's era, nobody could have even imagined that there would be a time of general emancipation. So there's even, I think, a deeper obligation that people felt to each other and to the community.
Our director, Tony, asked if you know of any accounts of enslaved cooks in Pennsylvania, since that's where our site is. I know you're.
I think we'd have to go back. We'd have to go back to probably 1790s. We might find, I can't remember when Pennsylvania outlawed slavery at some point, but it was a gradual emancipation as far as I can remember, right?
1780 was when the act was
generally
passed, but it took.
It was a gradual
decades.
emancipation.
Yeah.
So we'd have to go back into the records of the various, townships, and then lead houses, what kind of records they kept, to see, if there's something if there's a cook that got mentioned by name, or if someone, when they were emancipated and got freedom papers, which generally had to be registered somewhere to be able to prove that they were free. Sometimes those things give information about that. So while I don't know of any particular enslaved cook in Pennsylvania, certainly there were some, because we know there were elite houses and there was slavery, and we know that Hercules Posey, and we know that other males who were accompanied elite men in the political process were being fed, in this manner. So we just have to keep you know, that's part of the wonderful search in history, is to try to dig down into those documents and see where we can pull it apart and suss it out, and really figure, well, it had to be this, or she, you know, can we find a name? Shortly after, by the end of the 1780s, most of the time, in the 1790 census, I think, was the last one where many slaves were listed by name, which was, of course, if you're doing that kind of research, immensely helpful. After that, they tended to be listed just by number: 9 men, 5 women, 3 children, whatever, which makes it just very hard. And I think, of course, that it was because it just, you know, was very, nobody wanted, you know, just one way of distancing themselves from the reality, which is why the Jefferson records have become, are so important, because he kept the kind of records he kept. And, you know, of this community of people over many years, with names, with families. And I would argue that there are many of that same thing replicated. It's just that we don't have the records of it. We just don't have their names, of that kind of way of looking at the group. So they've become that documentation has become really important, and we rely on it a lot.
We have a couple more questions before we close out. Christine asks if all their meals were as large as the evening or late afternoon dinner, and what did they do with the leftovers from all these elaborate meals?
That's always the question. The dinner meal was the largest of the day. It tended to be in the summer, a little later, of course, after the heat of the day, and while you still had light. Remember, these people are still operating with candles and maybe a few little Aladdin lamps or something, but, you know, nothing fancy. So they're not eating in the dark too much, especially for this middle of the day meal. So then they have this tea/supper, and it's almost all this food gets recycled, reused, reconfigured so that it all gets eaten, and there really are no leftovers as we know it. These cooks are very good at portioning it, so that it all gets used, partly because they don't get any of the leftovers, and they cannot be seen to be harboring the leftovers or coveting the leftovers. And that would be that could be a very severe offense. And if you read the Richmond papers of anyway, from the teens all the way through the 40s, and you find the ads and the ads for runaways, and the ads for punishment, and the ads for people who were being sold, and all of that, you really get a strong sense of how severe the scrutiny was on Black people, and particularly in an elite household. The things that were part of these foods were very expensive things, and so it was the house mistress's job to keep track of that stuff. It was sugar and brandy and nutmeg and rice and spices and all things and lemons and oranges that came from afar, and they were all, you know, that were imported and got used. It was Jefferson, even though he raised all kinds of pigs, remember those 15 hogs, and that's in 1776, but he bought as many as 38, 39 Smithfield hams every year, because he really loved them. He really loved that ham. And so along with all of whatever, he also bought those and had them. And now that's an expense, and it's hanging in the meat house, and that meat house is going to be locked. And, you know, it's, so there's a lot of supervision going on, and leftovers are not really leftover in the way that I think we have come to think of leftovers.
Great. And our last question I think we have is from Michael. He asks how the jelly or preserves bottles were sealed. Was it with wax, like the paraffin that we use today, or did they use stoppers or something else?
Harriet Horry, with that tomato soup that I told you about that was going to be in the crocks, hers, once you have everything all stacked in, then you pour butter to seal it. So that might be an inch or two even of butter. In the same way, I know personally, people, I live in the mountains of the Appalachians, right, right below the Shenandoah National Park. And I know older people who can remember well when they would make patties of pork, when they butchered a pork and they ground it all, then they'd make patties of cooked pork. They'd stack them in these crocks, and then they'd fill that with hot lard all the way to the top. Now they'd still put a piece of oiled paper over that. And so for a lot of things like those jars of the sauce espagnole or the marmalades, sometimes it said you take buttered paper, and so because that kind of helps seal the paper, and you'd put that over, and then you tie that. Now we all know, that there'd be probably a lot more spoilage than we have today, and you try to use it up faster just because of the nature of that. But yeah, they were always having to figure out how to preserve this stuff at a time when what we've come to know now as canning, which is really only about 125 years old, just didn't exist. But it's a good question. I appreciate it.
Great. I think that takes care of everyone's questions. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. This was wonderful. And thanks to our participants for attending tonight and sticking with us through our technical glitches at the beginning. We will be posting the recording on our website. And if you go to the Newlin series page on our website, you can also sign up for our final Newlin series program of this season, which will be with Amanda Doggett. She is an apprentice joiner at Colonial Williamsburg, and she will be talking about women in trade, making ends meet, working women in the 18th century. And that will be on November 14th at 3 p.m. But you can get to the registration from there. So
I want to thank everybody. I haven't gotten to see you, as is often the case with these screens, which is really kind of fun. So I'm sorry that I didn't get to see you, but I really appreciate you coming to hear and what I say. And thank you very much for your questions. Those are really great questions that you put together. So au revoir. Come see me on my website, which is indigohouse.us.
And we will put that link under the recording on our website.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye-bye.